a massive welcome to all of you at this Bath for Europe event. We had over 400 signing up, so it's clear that truth does matter. As many of you know, Bath for Europe was formed as a non-party aligned campaign group in 2016 to fight Brexit. We attracted a range of very high-profile speakers. We held rallies. We supported the big national marches through organising transport. We even chartered a Remain train to London. We're still active, most recently helping local EU citizens in our area find out about the change in the rules and apply for settled status by the deadline of June the 30th. Since lockdown, we've held a range of speaker events on Zoom too, which have been recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel. Those include Michael Dugan, Ian Dunt, and fairly recently, Will Hutton. So just Google Bath for Europe, YouTube, and they should pop up. We're still really concerned with holding politicians and the government to account. And so that's why we're especially delighted to welcome Peter Oborne, tonight's speaker. But before I introduce Peter, I just want to give a few housekeeping rules. Just to let you know, this event is being recorded. And I think it's really important that you remain muted. And please, once we get going, would you turn your videos off, because I think that would increase and help the bandwidth. If you want to ask a question, please post your questions in the chat function and type the word question first, so we can separate the questions from the general chat. And I think we're probably ready now to introduce Peter. Peter Oborne has been an
Jane, you're muted. Can you start again and unmute yourself?
How much of it did you hear?
Peter Oborne.
Oh, right, you muted me then. Okay. Okay, right. Another one.
Oh, no. Sorry, Jane, I did it again. I meant to mute myself.
I think Emma's trying to shut me up.
It's my fault. I'm sorry. I'll stop now.
She keeps muting me. Okay, can I try again? Third time lucky. Peter Oborne has been an award-winning journalist for decades, previously writing for the Mail, Spectator, and the Telegraph, from which he famously resigned as political editor in 2015 over concerns about editorial content of the paper, that it was being adversely affected by its association with key advertisers, such as HSBC. A Conservative, he voted for Brexit in 2016. But in 2019, he announced he'd made a mistake. And from there, his life in journalism veered off in a completely different direction. He now writes for The Guardian, Open Democracy, Bylines, and Middle Eastern Eye. He's also got more than a few books and pamphlets under his belt, as well as several documentaries with one theme in common: political lying. We're here tonight to discuss Peter's book, his latest book, The Assault on Truth. It was published just a few months ago, and it's available from all good booksellers, but please buy local if you can. So Peter, a massive welcome, and can you unmute yourself? I'm not sure whether you muted yourself or whether Emma's muted you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can, loud and clear. Yeah. Peter, I was sent your book by a friend who I think might be on this call, who said you absolutely must read it. I did, and it completely knocked my socks off. I thought it was such a revelatory, well-documented expose of the industrial levels of deceit at the heart of our government. What I want to know is what prompted you to write it when you did at that time?
Yes, I had no intention of writing it. In fact, I wrote a book about political lying about 15 years ago, published in 2005 in the wake of the Iraq War. I wrote it about essentially about the lies of the Blair government and concentrating on Iraq. Because it had shattered me. It sort of was a transformative moment in my life as a journalist, the Iraq War, and the fact that the British government could lie about weapons of mass destruction in order to justify that war. It really shattered me. It was such a terrible thing, with the complicity of the intelligence service. And but thereafter, I kept a file of political lies, and just out of interest, really. And Gordon Brown was a relatively honest, decent prime minister. There were very few. Same with David Cameron. I mean, they were politicians, but it wasn't sort of Theresa May. And then when the moment that Boris Johnson turned up, it just went through the roof. I mean, every day there were several more. And it was quite shocking. And so the file was starting to bulge. I have files around me, and I just, and then there was something else happened which really upset me, was the press complicity with this lying, i.e., they didn't call him out. I mean, if you, when he told an obvious whopper, but B, something very sinister happened. And which was very important when they used something called Tory sources, a device. You probably heard it from leading broadcasters on the TV. Tory sources or Downing Street sources were saying this, that, or the other. And they were using leading political journalists, broadcasters, and political editors to pump out lies. I knew this because I understood what was happening, and there were lots of examples in connection actually with that standoff moment between Parliament and the Johnson government in the autumn of 2019. But the one which really upset me was when the Mail on Sunday splash, and I was had a column on the Daily Mail at the time, was that three leading British politicians, Dominic Grieve, Hilary Benn, Oliver Letwin, and by the way, those are three, I know them, or I followed their careers. I mean, they're utterly honourable people. Were under investigation from Downing Street for being in collusion with foreign powers and arguably taking money from foreign powers. And I read this splash, and it went into page 2. It was really given the full welly. It also, versions of it appeared in the Express, the Times, elsewhere. And I thought, this is terrible. It's obviously nonsense. I rang up Downing Street on the Monday morning, and I said, is there anything, is there an investigation? And they said, the press officer, who was an official, i.e. a civil servant, said, no, there's not an investigation. The following day, Boris Johnson went on the radio 4. He was interviewed by Nick Robinson. And he was asked about it, and he stood it up. He said, yes, there are big questions to investigate. And that was a very big moment for me, because I just thought, this is terrible. And anyway, at that point, I tried to write about it, couldn't get the Daily Mail to take a piece. I couldn't get the Spectator to take a piece. I couldn't get Channel 4 took an interest in taking a film about it, about the phenomenon, but they pulled out of it. And I realized there was a major press, and the BBC would never have gone near it. So you realize there was a major press complicity with the Johnson spin machine, the Cummings mob, basically, Dominic Cummings and his creatures inside number 10 Downing Street. And I wrote about it. That was really the end of my career as a mainstream journalist. I'd had a long career, very lucky, and I still can't get stuff in the papers anymore. I can't sell stuff to mainstream papers. It's had a devastating effect on my personal. I'm not complaining, by the way. I'm much happier. But then I went away. I thought, and then I still didn't think I read a book. But when COVID happened, and I suddenly saw a new wave of lies, sort of from the Johnson machine, that's when I thought, I am the only person in the world who can write this book. I really have thought about the issue of political lying, and I really, I know about it. I wrote a book about Blair. You can't accuse me of being party pre on this. Actually, it would be an abuse of my knowledge and my experience if I didn't write this this book because, and it was agony to write. It's horrible. It's like driving around a sort of awful derelict building or area, which has been, and it made me feel so dirty and ashamed, actually. But I mean, it was a horrible thing to have to write, but I felt somebody had to do it. Sorry, it's a long answer to your question.
It's a brilliant answer. You've actually taken up at least 3 of my questions, because I would like to say one thing, and I think you've answered that. When we had Will Hutton here a few weeks ago, he said that you were one, if not the most courageous journalist that he knew, and he wasn't sure that he'd have the guts to do what you did. And I was going to say, what has that cost you? And I think you've actually shown us you've basically not been able to go down the channels that you were going down before. Talking about the press, though, you talk about the publicity and you talk about that instance with Letwin, Grieve and Ben. But they also smeared Hammond, didn't they, with Yellowhammer? So what was all that about? And how many more instances do you feel that the press have been complicit in constructing or helping Downing Street construct their own narrative, a pro-government narrative?
Just to say, really, that I wouldn't say I was very courageous, actually, because I do quite a lot of being a foreign correspondent on a part-time basis. And I've met so many people in countries where, you know, if you say something out of place, the regime will come and get you, and they won't just get you, they'll torture you, disappear you, and then go after your families as well. And they carry on. So the minor inconvenience of not being employable on Fleet Street doesn't count for a great deal. But given the number of people I've had the honor of working with abroad who have taken such immense risks, so courage comes in. On the Yellowhammer one was another one. It happened at the same time, actually, roughly. It was the Sunday Times ran a story, didn't it, saying that there was a leaked document which had a rather dramatic scenario from the Treasury warning of the dangers of no deal. And it was important. It was a genuinely leaked document. It was very contemporary, and it set out the devastation to the British economy if there was no deal. And the response of Downing Street was to blame this on Philip Hammond. Now, it couldn't have been Hammond, because the document which was leaked had been prepared after he'd ceased to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. But what they were doing was saying that Hammond was a terrible person because he'd taken documents with him out of the out of the Treasury and leaked them to the papers. It was done. It wasn't. They didn't. And here again, you had a particularly unpleasant way of doing it. They didn't. They only named them behind the scenes, whispered it to journalists who then ran it. And this was another problem I very much disliked, that journalists were taking slurs, smears from people inside Downing Street, and then using them to really destroy the reputation of very respectable. Personally, I'm no fan of Hammond, by the way. But he's a perfectly respectable person, and making out that he probably was breaking the law. And the journalists were happy to be complicit in passing on that kind of smear, and it worked. Because the following morning, the story in the papers was not the British economy will bomb if we have a no deal. It was, who was it who leaked it was turned into a whodunit. Yeah. And I felt quite ashamed. It was another reason I left. I wanted to expose this bent system, what had basically become a bent system.
How do journalists feel? You know, I mean, you've obviously taken a real big stand about this, but I mean, I remember sometime, you know, during the whole Brexit thing, I was reading an article in the Express, and actually the headline, for no relation to the article, if you actually read the article, it was actually quite sensible and quite balanced. But the headline came in and it screamed at you, and it obviously had this very, very anti-EU narrative. And I thought, well, if you actually read the article, it was okay. But do you feel that there's an awful lot of conflict amongst the journalists who work in the right wing, well, probably the left wing press as well, but in the right wing press?
I think the bigger problem is in the right wing press at the moment. I mean, the headline, to be fair, a perennial issue. I mean, what will happen is the subs or the editor will slap on. I can see why a sensational headline to attract readers, and actually what you've written is much more moderate than that. And I've spent quite a lot of my career trying to fight this off. And I'm sure I'm not alone about that, because as a writer, you're not responsible, and you don't cast the headline. But you are right. I don't think that situation's got any worse, particularly. It's always been that one.
And talking about things getting worse, you actually said in the flyleaf of the book, this book proves that the scale and shamelessness of the lying of the Johnson government far exceeds anything Britain has experienced before. Well, a few weeks ago, Nigel Lawson was in the Times, and he was saying Tory sleaze ain't what it used to be. And of course, he came up with the perhaps we've forgotten them, the scandals of the 80s and the 90s, where we had Archer and Aitken imprisoned, and Alan Clark was selling tools to Saddam Hussein and got away with it. And he was saying, well, in those days, it was even worse than it is now. How would you?
I read that piece. It was Dominic, I think. Not
was that okay? Fair enough.
Yeah. In the Sunday Times. The reason that's wrong is Jonathan Aitken's thing was personal. It was not structural. He wasn't when he went to Paris. As far as we know, he didn't go there on government business. And when he lied about it. He perjured himself in court, and that was a personal thing. He was a rogue trader, as it were, and he was not. I mean, Maggie had always distrusted him, and never gave him a job. Their major, he's a talented man, gave him a job in the government, and then he perjured himself. That was a personal matter, not a structural or institutional issue. The same with Jeffrey Archer. Jeffrey Archer is a very distracting issue, because he was only deputy chairman. He was actually a most engaging figure, and obviously a fantasist. Anybody who had any eyes in their head knew that. And he perjured himself as well. And again, it's a private matter. It wasn't an institute. He was never part of a government, so he was deputy chairman of the party. And Alan Clark, that's during the Thatcher years. I agree. That was more raison d'etat, I think. And I would see there were reasons why British state wanted to pump arms to Iraq. And I don't think that was a party political corruption, if you understand me, really. Whereas what we have now, and I just worth going through some of them, we have these. You have the Prime Minister. We start with the Prime Minister, who's now under how many investigations?
Is it 9?
Yeah, but he has a long record of ignoring the rules, and dating back to when he was Foreign Secretary, he was not declaring things, and then of course we have the wallpaper thing, which is quite extraordinary, by the way, and then we. Have this endless contracts going to Tory donors. It's quite improper. I mean, it's very, and we have awful episodes like the generic business with Richard Desmond. Now, I don't want to get sued. I know there's going out, but I think I'm being careful what I'm saying. But it's very systemic. And of course, you've got to be careful with your language, to use the term, not to use the term corruption without proof. but you can certainly talk of every Nolan principle, which John Major, to his great credit, another reason why Dominic Lawson was talking through his head, John Major, in the wake of Arms to Iraq, commissioned Lord Nolan to do a report on standard, and he produced these scripturally perfect Nolan rules. Dominic Lawson failed to mention that. And they're all being, but without exception, they are being ignored. Ministerial code doesn't even exist in Downing Street at the moment. So ministers are no longer being asked to declare their interests. Do you realise that? They got rid of the ethics boss, Alan, because he disagreed with the Prime Minister about Priti Patel. Priti Patel and the alleged bullying. I can't remember the exact status of that.
He resigned, didn't he? And she stayed.
He left, I think, over that. And then there was a huge period when they didn't advertise the job and didn't replace him. And then we got the wallpaper. And now Lord Geit, who I look forward to, I think he's rather good news, Lord Geit. There's been a rather sort of ignorant class of journalists who says Lord Geit's a courtier. He was private secretary to the Queen, and therefore he's patsy. Quite the opposite. He's a former soldier, a former diplomat. I think that Lord Geit is a real human being with a proper set of standards and knocked around the world a bit. And he will be a strong contrast to these louche metropolitan journalists, people who know nothing about the world of politics and journalism, who Mr. Johnson surrounds himself with.
Well, I think we're all a little bit overwhelmed by scandal after scandal, whether it's, as you say, Wallpapergate, Catch for Cushions, Al-Khoury, and the holiday, I think, is popped up again, and that's being investigated.
Yes, indeed.
Are you still are you still continuing to take your notes? And will there be a sequel? Will there be more about the lies?
Well, I'll tell you what I have done. You might even advise me, because I kept my files going.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things I did when I left the Daily Mail was to start a website at my own expense, actually.
Okay. Called
BorisJohnsonLies.com, and it got me. I took it up to the election, and it did form the research basis. Some of Assault on Truth, but I went on keeping the files, and I've got enormous files of probably 200 or 300 further lies, I expect, which probably a bit more, maybe 300 or 400 lies, false statements, misleading statements by the Prime Minister or by some of his advisors and by his ministers. An enormous number of them. Now, what do I do with them? The thing is that you have to be utterly scrupulous when you identify a lie. You've got to nail it, and then you've got to research it, and you want to present it to the people you're calling a liar. It's an enormous amount of work, and then write it up, and you need to. And I would love to bring the website up to date from where it currently ends. I think the 13th of December 2019. And I would like. I'm very inclined to do that. I just need some. I don't know, I need some funding for it.
I'd be perhaps some researchers, if there's anyone listening to this call who wants to offer some help, that would be great.
And research, indeed. And indeed,
researchers.
I've got an enormous weight of this material, which needs...
I have to say your book, that was the one thing, well, not the one thing, that was the thing that so impressed me. It's a thin book, it's not that big, but there is so much, every single fact has been substantiated. I felt that this is a record of truth, and I think that to me seems so fresh at the moment. Can I talk to you a little bit about the pandemic? You talk in the book about Johnson's blame shifting during the first part of the pandemic. Could you elaborate on that? And do you reckon that the vaccine rollout, which has obviously been a success, will mask the criticisms? And also, do you think that Dominic Cummings, when he presents himself at the coronavirus inquiry on May the 26th, will say anything that will be revelatory? Have you had any thoughts on that?
Starting with Dominic Cummings,
yeah.
I mean, he certainly set himself up to say revelatory things. I think his thesis will be that Johnson was negligent in going in avoiding lockdown and just disregarded important advice. He has made a. I have no time at all for Dominic Cummings. He's a wholly malign influence on British politics, and he showed a gross error of judgment by the British Prime Minister to hire him. And he brought with him into Downing Street some most unappetizing individuals. And he should have been fired at the time of Barnard Castle. I couldn't think why he wasn't. But nevertheless, he was the Prime Minister's closest advisor for inside Downing Street for more than a year, and then he left 6 months ago. And he therefore has got the authority and the knowledge to be able to make very credible allegations or statements about the conduct of Boris Johnson in Downing Street. There's one particular outstanding matter, which is the remark which the Prime Minister allegedly made about piles of bodies, which was all over the front page of the Mail and then substantiated by both Laura Kuenssberg and Peston. Now, Johnson denied that, saying that to Starmer. Now, on the floor of the House, everybody's got it. And I think that although Mr. Johnson's made numerous false statements in the House of Commons, to have said this remark about piles of bodies, and it can be proved that he did say it, it'd have to be somebody very respectable coming forward and say, I heard it. I don't know whether the Prime Minister at that point would be able to survive.
So that might be the one thing that could actually bring him down if he actually.
That's one thing. I mean, also Cummings, I expect, will have other instances of very poor behaviour or behaviour. You see, if he can say, look, he made this decision against advice, which led to thousands of otherwise needless deaths. I mean, I think that's a very serious thing. Mind you, it is true that Mr. Johnson is completely infallible at the moment. I don't know why, but it's a very it tells us much more about us than him. I mean, us collectively as a country. We seem to be ready to entertain a proven and demonstrable liar.
I have got one final question before I hand you over, because I know we've got 343 people here and they will have questions as well. My final question is, how has Downing Street reacted to your book? I mean, obviously there are some very serious allegations. You have substantiated it. Have they actually made any noises in your direction, or have you heard nothing?
I sent a copy to the Prime Minister, actually, because I thought it would be good for him to read it. But I haven't heard. To be fair, I wasn't actually very. I'm having quite a lively correspondence with Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House.
Oh, right. Okay.
Because I sent it to Jacob Rees-Mogg, I said, you're a man of upstanding principle and high propriety, and we know that. Stickler. And yet you're leader of the House, where ministers, including the Prime Minister, routinely fabricate and lie. I think fabricate and make misleading statements. And John, I got a very strict letter back from Mr. Rees-Mogg saying, I absolutely reject your allegations, and that that it is the duty of ministers to tell the truth in the House of Commons. And anyway, this correspondence isn't over yet, and because I think that Rees-Mogg ought to be held to account as leader of the House. I also sent it to the Speaker of the House, which I eventually got quite a nice reply from him, and I think he is concerned and embarrassed, but he claims to have very few powers to do anything about it. I sent it to Keir Starmer and got a very sort of pro forma response. But it is a gross issue. It's a really serious issue. If you have suddenly gone into a form of parliamentary democracy where there is no such thing as truth, which is where we are at the moment, and where there's no accountability for lying, I don't know where it ends up. I mean, it's something worth speculating.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. It has been brilliant chatting to you. And I would actually love to invite you back for a part 2, because I think we could just talk for hours and hear you talking for hours about all this. I'm now going to hand over to Emma Knages, chair of our group, who's going to be asking the audience's questions. So thank you once again. It's been brilliant.
Thanks, Jane. That's a really good job. And thank you, Peter, for your incredible insights. As you may have guessed, we have an awful lot of questions from a lot of people. So I will try and get through as many as we can, but I apologise ahead of time if I don't get around to your question. So first of all, Peter, what is your best hope for change? Would it be some sort of rebel alliance or a counter disinformation effort, press reform, constitutional reform? Where do we start, really?
I do have some suggestions about new forms of accountability. I think the House of Commons has to change its procedures, because it's based on the assumption they're all honourable gentlemen, and it's, in fact, it's you get thrown out of the House if you accuse another MP of being a liar. You can't do it, and within that sort of paradigm, it's actually impossible to hold anybody to account, particularly if the Prime Minister has a majority of 80. So unless, and it should be said in that context that every Tory MP is complicit in this, because they are giving their assent. While there is a Conservative majority, the Prime Minister can go on telling to use the correct parliamentary language, false statements on the floor of the House till kingdom come. Nothing can be done about it. And so I think we are pressing for changes of procedure in the House of Commons itself. And I do think, though, us as voters have a role, and I'm thinking of putting forward a petition to Parliament because if Parliament won't respond, then it won't to the mounting evidence. I mean, the mounting and undeniable evidence that there is a systemic problem of falsehood coming from the ministers and the Prime Minister. Perhaps if there was a petition, and I'm thinking about how we do that. So, I mean, if you would, I put one in last week or the week before, and I didn't use the right language, I think, and I got to find the right language for a petition to be accepted. And then if that gained wide traction, millions of, there's a wonderful man, I never met him, I greatly approve of what he's doing, called Peter Stefanovic, I think Communication Workers Union, who's compiled a set of examples of the Prime Minister making false statements on the floor of the House. And it's been viewed 16 or 17 million times. Mm-hmm. And yet the House of, the BBC won't discuss it. It won't get debated on the floor of the House. So there are sort of blockages which we have to overcome. But I think we will be able to, in due course, I think there will be enough anxiety about this among ordinary people. A lot of the people we're talking here tonight, that I think we will be able to confront the issue in due course as fast as we can.
No, absolutely. That leads me to a couple of different questions. I can't find the exact question, but someone asked about the parliamentary petition system and whether it was tokenistic, because really there's very little that has actually come out of petitions that have gone through to Parliament. And they seem, I mean, I've been signatories to several of them where you just get a sort of fobbing off response from the government, and it doesn't really seem to go anywhere or actually engender change.
Well, I think that if we've got a petition accepted, I've got to work out the right language, or maybe there's one out there already, which we can look at and back, and then millions of people put their names to it. It'd be very hard for Parliament at that point to avoid debating the issue. Once it's being debated on the floor of the House, it'd be rather hard, I think, for government ministers to argue in favour of lying. So they'd have to sort of, it'd be an interesting moment. I think we need extra this is it. To put it in an old-fashioned way, we need extra parliamentary action now to confront the endemic lying from ministers.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, John Bercow appeared on Good Morning Britain this morning, and he was confirming that the days of ministers correcting the record after a mistruth seem to be gone. So is one of the things necessary to afford more power to the Speaker of the House?
I think the House of Commons needs to change its procedures, but it's impossible to do that while there's a Conservative majority of 80. And I would say that I think you should confront. I do think you should write to your MPs, and if they lie, write to them and hold them accountable, and also ask them, make them accountable for other lies by ministers. They'll have to deal with your letters. And I do this. I write to them quite a lot. I got suggestions in the back about how to confront your MP about these matters. I'm in correspondence with various MPs on various issues, such as the smog. I think because the point is, the conduct from Mr. Johnson and various ministers would be unacceptable if they were a company director. They would be disbarred, or anybody in business. You wouldn't be able to survive. Nobody would do business with you, and in some positions you'd go to jail, and you wouldn't accept it from your friends. They just lied to you all the time, or your spouse, or and what a message it sends out to your children, the children, young people. Just tell. And I think what they are thinking, and I think they're calculating in a sort of maybe not fully conscious way, they're just spreading the idea that all politicians lie, so there's nothing to truth doesn't exist. So they're, and they're smearing, and that is bringing the British political system into disrepute. Absolutely. In a terrible way.
Yeah, and Boris Johnson happily lies to his spouse and his children and the Queen and everybody in between. So yes, he's completely shameless in my opinion. Next question. Are major political editors or journalists with the key broadcasters merely following orders from above to protect Johnson, or do you think they're doing it off their own back to curry favour?
I don't know quite what you mean by orders from above. If you're the editor, you are above, aren't you?
No, from the government basically putting...
The government does not as such have any power to tell newspapers what to do or how to report it. They have methods they can use, i.e. withholding information. The power of access, I think it's quite frightening. And I think it's very hard for people who aren't in this business to understand how much it matters. If you're a political editor on one of the leading broadcasters and you ask difficult questions of the Prime Minister, you will immediately find that your access is denied. You won't be called to give questions at press conferences. You'll never get the big interviews, and then your desks will start to ask, why aren't you getting the interview with the Prime Minister or the various ministers, and you will be sacked in the end. That's the calculation. One of the reasons, to give one example, he's a very good, Andrew Marr, but the reason he's very soft in a way is that he has to bring them back every week, and so he's and if he doesn't bring them back, what's the point of his show? And so, and then the other way they use access is information. And so this, for political editors on newspapers, if you're not getting, if you're cut out by Downing Street, if you're not being fed information, you get sacked for that quite quickly. And of course, the political editor of a newspaper has to deal with his editor and in turn his proprietor. So Murdoch will have a policy, for instance, that he likes Johnson, and Murdoch may have, and then his editors will have that policy, and the political editor, there is a very strict sort of line of control there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. So although there isn't this huge conspiracy behind the scenes of being sort of controlled by the state, but ultimately the two have to go hand in hand, and it's from a position of power.
There is a very, very troubling complicity between the media and the press and this government. It's not unique, by the way. It happened during the high. Mr. Johnson is probably as powerful and as Blair was in the run up to the Iraq War, and when you're powerful like that, it's very hard even to write a bad story and get a bad story into the paper. And the policy of many papers is to just stay close to Downing Street, and they'll give you the scoops, they'll break you, and they use access absolutely ruthlessly to keep papers in line.
Absolutely fascinating. So next question. The truth is often unclear, nuanced and complex. However, this does not win elections. Vague three-word slogans have now become the modus operandi for winning democratic exercises. For example, get Brexit done. Does democracy discourage the truth? And sort of second question that links into this, why do so many people seem to believe whatever Boris Johnson says?
I think that's right, actually, that there's a lot of wisdom in that question, that politics sort of, it is a drawback. I mean, we're all Democrats, but a drawback of democracy is that it gets reduced very easily, particularly by unscrupulous governments, to a set of sort of winning phrases. It's always been the case. So get Brexit done. It's a classic. It was complete nonsense. It was never any, it didn't mean anything at all, but it sounded as if it did, and it really cut through. And in those, and I think in that case, there was not a sophisticated discussion about Northern Ireland and trade and barriers and all the rest of it. It was just, and any discussion of it was as an obstacle to this get Brexit done. And so I think it did debase. It meant that the public argument, and as conducted in the media as well and in the pub, it was not really about what was actually happening. It was almost fantasy.
Absolutely. And why do you think people believed it?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not really a psephologist.
Okay, fair
enough. Really say. I don't want to make sweeping statements about, but certainly Johnson has discovered some magic elixir which connects him with voters. Why did people believe Tony Blair when he took us to war, which actually was, I think, a more serious matter because it had such terrible consequences across, the whole Middle East. I think the things you can point at, one is the media, which goes along with this stuff, legitimizes it. I mean, and the authority of a major broadsheet or a tabloid paper, it looks official and good, and that's one reason. Also, I think that skillful politicians prey on the weaknesses of human nature.
Sort of links a little bit to that. Why do you think the Daily Mail has turned on Boris recently?
Yeah, this is I can answer this question with some, I think, a little bit of authority, not because I know any internal information, but I've watched what's happening here, and I understand how difficult the stories are which the Mail has been getting. The wallpaper story, which is not really about wallpaper, of course, it's about Tory funding and private money going into the Prime Minister's bank account or to the, is really difficult to get, extraordinarily difficult to get. Now, the journalist who's done most of those stories, Simon Walters, I've known him for 30 years. He's a friend of mine. And I know how scrupulous he is and how, you know, and how he doesn't, he's a journalist, he's actually an old-fashioned reporter. He's older than I am, even older than I am. And I have nothing, by the way, I'm not a friend of Geordie Craig at all, who's the editor of the Daily Mail. What he's done is done what Alan Rusbridger did for Nick Davies. When Alan Rusbridger was the editor of The Guardian, there's a brilliant journalist called Nick Davies who exposed the phone hacking story, actually. And Rusbridger would just tell Nick Davies to go away for 6 months and pursue an investigation. And he'd come back with something amazing, and the most amazing one of all was the Murdoch Press and phone hacking. And clearly what Mr. Gregg, I'm outside the organization now, but I was in it. So I can see that Mr. Gregg has just given Mr. Walters the freedom and the resources to go away and do just that. Now, it doesn't mean that the paper's changed its policy. And I think one of the, I've seen an awful lot of this sort of talk. Oh, why has Lord Rothermere turned against, you know, why is the Daily Mail turned against the government? Actually, what they've done is practice good, solid, old-fashioned journalism, following up leads, and I can tell you those stories, you know, naming donors who've signed checks and they've done this and they've ended up here, and bringing about an electoral investigation, and those stories are incredibly hard to do. And the reason why people think this is many of our competitors are just a part of the culture of free handouts, which I'm talking about. You know, that you just take a call from a government spin doctor, and you know, or a Downing Street spokesman, and they say, here you are, this is the contents of tomorrow's defence review, or this is the contents, here you are, we're giving you exclusively the budget, you know, just to mention 2 recent leaks. And so you just take it, you write it down, and you do what you're told. And so people think the Mail has turned against the government. It hasn't. It's just had an outbreak of journalism. I'm very much in favour of it.
Excellent. Well, we are as well. It's nice to occasionally see some slightly more positive things in the Mail. Have you, Peter, ever personally been pressured to lie in your job? Sorry, it's quite a big question.
I don't think so. I mean, what you are pressured to do is to write a piece you don't believe in, or write a piece you know to be wrong. And I like to think that for the most part, I've managed to resist those pressures. And all of us, you know, the editor will have a clever idea and want you to write it, and you go when you can't. And normally you have a polite conversation about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Gina Miller and other sort of commentators have been speculating recently about an earlier general election, and particularly with links to the repeal of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which is probably likely to be in sort of early 2023. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on an early general election, whether that would be likely or not.
Well, I think there's a lot of speculation about it because, and it's greatly enhanced by today's Queen's speech, I think, which I believe repeals the Fixed Term Parliament Act. And, well, I haven't studied it. And it's been talked about for some time, actually, that they will go in the spring of 2023 and make use of the current popularity of the government. It's dangerous. I mean, Ted Heath went in after 3.5 years, didn't he, in the spring of 1974, after 3.5 years. and the voters didn't want it. It's people sort of hustled into a general election. But yeah, there's a lot of this talk, and there's a lot of Gina Miller is reflecting quite informed talk at Westminster.
Right. Be prepared, basically.
Only 2 years' time, yeah.
Yes, it's not that long. Do you think that once Boris Johnson got away with proroguing Parliament, that from then on we were in really serious trouble, and it further empowered Boris Johnson to act with impunity?
Up to a point, I think, but the terrible mistake at that time, remember, thanks to a sympathetic speaker, the government was actually in paralysis. It couldn't move on Brexit. And the Labour leader of the Lib Dems, what's her name, who's now resigned, made this astonishing decision, which, I mean, absolutely appalling decision. She misread her own popularity, thought that, well, I call it, she read an opinion poll, and she set in motion, she undid all the paralysis, and Jeremy Corbyn went along with it, and they presented Boris Johnson with an election he was always going to win. It's probably the worst and most idiotic political decision of I can think of in recent years. She was also a minister at the height of the great post office debacle, she was the responsible minister when all of these postmasters were being, I don't know, it's very important. On the subject, by the way, there's a journalist who really deserve a cheer. This journalist Wallace, is called, I forget his first name, he's a freelancer, worked away for ages, all these postmasters who were being accused of theft by the post office because after they'd installed a new computer system, which was losing the money. And there was one suicide, there was sort of off jail sentences, terrible story. I'm afraid that, I'm not going off the track, but the lady whose name I've managed to obliterate from my mind, who led the Lib Dem, she was the responsible minister, as was Ed Davey at a certain time. And they now have Joe Swinson, I can see, thank you.
Swinson, yeah.
But Ed Davey and Joe Swinson have really serious questions to answer. They were both at different times responsible for this when the post office was doing the most awful things to these wonderful sub-postmasters whose lives were wrecked. Mm. And this one wonderful journalist called Wallace, I can't remember his first name, writing in magazines like Computer Weekly for a while, crowdfunding it, no paper backing him. And then Private Eye picked it up, then Panorama did. He is a hero, the ultimate hero of our profession, because he's rescued all of these people from imagine how awful it must have been for these sub-postmasters.
Yes, absolutely. And well, they've only just been exonerated, haven't they?
Nick Wallace, thank you very much. Very useful. Somebody said.
So we talk a lot about Boris Johnson as an individual, but when he goes, what's next? Is there a second liar in the in the wings just waiting, or once Boris moves on, can we see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, one would like to think so, and there are alternatives even in the Conservative Party with integrity, like Jeremy Hunt, who I would quite like to see. But it's worth bearing in mind that the electorate for the next Tory leader will be the Tory party members. And something has gone horribly wrong with the Conservative Party. It's become a sort of far-right party in many ways. There's a very bright New Statesman columnist called Cliff, who wrote a piece about a year ago or more, comparing Johnson to Oborne in Hungary. It's clientelistic, which is an academic term to mean it buys people. And you can see this, the way they fought the last local elections, this sort of threats to constituencies: if they don't vote for us, you won't get any money. It's very corrupt, you know, the money going to donors. It's very bigoted. But yet it's hugely high spending. It's economically left, but culturally very right wing, and it goes after minorities, particularly Muslims now. And I think that and the voters have come. A lot of them have come from UKIP, possibly further right, and they are going to decide the next Conservative Party leader. And the Tory party itself, I don't understand anymore, because of course a lot of new ones came in, and they seem very inexperienced, and without that sort of wisdom and pragmatism which the Tory party large parts of the Tory party used to have, not all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was obviously a big campaign with Vote Leave campaigners to have new Conservative members who would specifically vote for Boris Johnson. Obviously, that also happened with the Labour Party voting for Keir Starmer. So the swings and roundabouts, really. Next question. So at the end of the open democracy piece in your book, you say that people have ceased to be ashamed of lying, and that emotion is more powerful than truth and facts. This obviously needs to be countered not by truer facts, but by better emotions. Is this the way forward, or will it make things worse?
I think we have. I think what we are living through is I think the fact is that Mr. Johnson tells us more about ourselves than it does about the fact we've elected him as a country. And I think that we're going to have to live through. I think he will become unpopular at a certain stage, and I think all politicians do, even if they're very good ones. And as with Trump in the States, the question was a second term. Would you be a second term of Trump? And the miracle of democracy gave us Joe Biden. Now, Johnson, what happens after him? It may, you can see it going in really unpleasant ways, because it's the methodology of Johnson is to attack institutions. The Conservative Party was born out of institutions, really. It was born after the French Revolution. It was about the established order, i.e. Parliament, landowners, the rule of law, and the monarchy, probably then above all the monarchy. And this Johnson government is about tearing down, it's about attacking Parliament, mocking the rule of law, ignoring due process, sabotaging the civil service. And if you start killing off institutions, it's replaced by by direct rule. In many ways, that's what Tony Blair tried to do, by the way. And the tendency is towards some form of autocracy, and a very corrupt autocracy. And you can see it going. The route we've gone down for the last 2 years continues. It gets worse and worse. And then in bad times, you target minorities. We're already seeing that. And it becomes a very bleak future.
Yes, hopefully we will make it out of the other side. Coming on to a slightly different topic, why were you in favour of Brexit originally, and what changed your mind?
Yeah, there were very good reasons for Brexit. The two big reasons I went for it were one, it's not exactly, and the European Union isn't exactly anti-democratic, but it's non-democratic. And I was very influenced by an academic essay, The Emergence of a Cartel Party by Peter Mayer, who's now dead, an Irish academic, which it sort of disenfranchises politicians. It means that there's a lot of, because decisions are made so far away, they're not really responsible for what happens, and then they blame distant places. I thought that it was I thought it was very bad for democracy, and I thought, and I was very struck by what happened to Greece and Italy. Basically, it condemned, the European Union condemned quite a large parts of the peripheries to economic stagnation and massive unemployment. And what happened in Greece was shocking. But on the other hand, I did, that's why I voted as I did. It wasn't like it was 100% choice, though we could see there were other. But I think I was negligent in not understanding the trading relationships. And although I thought about the issue of the union, which I strongly support, I didn't think about it enough. Anyway, I read a long essay for open democracy, wasn't it? Saying that I changed my mind.
Read that then.
Yeah.
Great. Why do you think so many people were attracted by the notion of Brexit?
Well, it's very instinctively, it's right. Because instinctively, you want to, it was a democratic, well, there are all kinds of reasons which academics have looked at. But instead, the sense that we're a nation and want to make national decisions, and if decisions are made elsewhere, that's a problem. That's pretty reasonable. But of course, it gets muddled up with other issues of sort of fantasy matters about sort of returning to World War II and quaint ideas of sovereignty. I think it was a very educational process. And the other thing about it was that people who backed the European Union, not all of them, but the advocates, they weren't absolutely, they were untrustworthy too. I mean, Cameron, Osborne, Mandelson didn't sort of appeal very much as politicians or advocates. But I think I made the wrong decision. I have to live with that. I wake up, God, I shouldn't have done that.
Coming back to more current events, so obviously some of the announcement in the Queen's speech today are very concerning, and some of them it appears to be trying to suppress some voters. How can we counter this? What can we do? I guess it's possibly coming back to the original message.
I don't know what you do, because the Conservative Party has a majority of 80. And you can't fight that. And what do you do? I agree with entirely that. I mean, that photo IDs, it's the hypocrisy of Johnson. He's totally against ID cards. I mean, really against them. And the fact that it isn't a problem. There's six cases in the last 20 years or something. Exactly. It's Trump, you see, that is voter suppression, isn't it? And there is a problem with the postal voting. We know that. To have intelligently dealt with the postal voting issue, which we've seen, it would have been a good idea, because it's clearly open to abuse, and there's quite a lot of evidence of that. But this is sinister, I think.
But they have an 80-seat majority, so it's going to go through.
Yeah, I don't see there's anything, and it'll help the Conservatives. It'll disenfranchise people. That's why they're really doing it, I think. And
predominantly those that don't vote Conservative.
Yeah, the people who find it difficult to get a photo ID are going to be poorer people, aren't
they? Yeah. So do you think Boris Johnson is an existential threat to democracy? Quite a big term.
I think the way you answer that question is by, you can say, first of all, that he is a manifestation of democracy. I mean, democracy is not just a good thing, it's also a bad thing. Didn't E.M. Forster say 2 cheers for democracy? And democracy, I mean, it's democracy, what we have in this country is representative democracy, i.e. democracy as mediated through institutions like the Parliament, the rule of law, i.e. we don't choose judges, very important. We don't elect judges, sorry. Monarchy, which I think is much more important to a representative. I'm a strong monarchist because the Queen is above politics, and therefore you can see the way that Johnson and before him Blair strained to be the state c'est moi. And that's really dangerous when they seize the symbols of state. And if it can be a way, and all of those symbols of state are away. And you can, a lot of what Johnson does is try to be the Queen, all these changes in, I don't mean personally be the Queen, but use that symbolism of state. He's not an existential threat to democracy in the sense that he is an existential form of democracy. What he is an existential threat to what Britain has had in various different forms since 1688, a representative democracy.
Which is also based on them being honourable gentlemen, and
no, it's based on not being honourable gentlemen. The whole idea of representative democracy is you have all these institutions which act as prophylactics to the greed and venality of politicians. No, it's the full knowledge of the weakness of human nature. And you build the House of all these institutions which I strongly support, like the House of Lords, the monarchy, the rule of law. They're there out of a form of wisdom to stop everything being Britain being governed in too democratic a way. With Johnson, we have democracy. We have to accept that, I think. He does very well in elections. Isn't that called democracy?
I guess so. Is there any hope for the future of the news and investigative reportage, as we tend to seek out only evidence and opinion that reinforces our own personal prejudices? And combined with the bombardment of fake news, can we ever expect to hold anyone to account for anything?
Yeah, I mean, the premise of that question is very important, namely that, we seem to have chosen to divide ourselves into 2 camps. You know, we get more and more part of some tribe, which, and you just read who you're agreeing with. And truth, it's probably the biggest theme of my book, which is that truth has ceased to become a matter of truth and falsehood, but become truth and error, which is obviously a religious idea at the start. It was that idea which led to the wars of the Reformation. But the trouble about that, and again, returning to truth and error means, and which we see in all kinds of different ways, is it means a whole, first of all, it becomes very vicious. You're always attacking people very viciously for disagreeing with you, or accusing them of the most terrible motives. But also, you're taking away the common ground up to what the Victorians established, Gladstone and Northcote Trevelyan, all this established was this common ground which we share. David Marquand, his wonderful book, The Public Domain, sets out this common territory of truth, and also institutions like the BBC, the NHS, the public libraries, all sorts of wonderful things which we have, playing fields, common playing fields, and they're all what he calls the public domain. And what we've done now, this government is worse than anybody else, is privatized truth in the same way as they privatized the water companies or they privatized telecom. It's become something which is about you weaponize for personal gain and political gain.
Okay, we're coming close to time, but I'll ask one last question, which just sort of follow on from that. So if it is the case that lying is becoming normalized, what choices do an honest politician still have? Do they persist in their integrity or accept defeat and join the moral low ground and fight fire with fire?
Yeah, well, so this is the question for Keir Starmer. Let's assume that Keir Starmer is, for the sake of argument, and I think he is, by the way, an honest politician. I don't think he's a very good politician, but I do think he's quite honest. I really hope that he carries on persisting for truth and integrity, because even if you lose, it's a worthwhile fight to have, and somebody can take up the mantle. And if you join this, if you try and copy Johnson, we are all doomed, actually. We're all damned anyway.
Absolutely. So yes, carry on fighting for truth. And obviously we as meager little citizens will try and lobby our MPs and raise it wherever possible. But as you say, with an 80-seat majority, it's quite hard to push that through. I think, although I've not covered everyone's questions, hopefully I've sort of done a tour of the themes. Thank you very much, Peter. That was really fascinating conversation. I'll pass back to Jane to wrap up.
Well, absolutely. What a fascinating evening. And thank you to everybody for coming along, because I think we've actually had a really broad range of questions. We could certainly keep Peter here for another hour, but we won't do that to him. But perhaps, Peter, you will come back on another occasion and spend time with us. Thank you very much to all of you. If you check our website, Bath for Europe, you will be able to see any latest events that we have. Thank you for spending the evening with us. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Peter. It was great. And thanks, everyone.
Yes, let's give Peter a clap.
Well done, Peter. It's a very quiet clap. Everyone's muted.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Peter. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.